Dialogue on Teaching, Wabash Center's podcast series. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. Paul Myrie, Senior Associate Director, is in the sound engineer's booth. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show today my colleague and my friend, Dr. Leo A. Sánchez. Dr. Sánchez is Professor of Systematic Theology, as well as Director of the Center for Hispanic Studies and the Warner R.H. Krause Professor of Hispanic Ministries with Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Welcome, Leo, to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Yes.
Good to be here.
So let's start talking about a topic that we have not talked about before, because we ask our guests to bring their own topics, right? So let's talk about immigration. That you recently taught a course in immigration on the theologies of immigration. Immigration is a topic that is swirling around us all the time, and more specifically, as schools across the country are getting an uptick in recent immigrant populations, I'm going to say it that way. People are struggling with this notion of diversity, these phenomena of immigration, and the struggle is our lack of preparedness. So help us understand, help us frame some of the issues that you taught, and as well as help us think through what this immigration, how this immigration affects our teaching.
Yeah, this is a wonderful way of putting it. Our lack of preparedness. I've never thought of it that way.
Because immigration is not new to this country.
I know. And yet I think what happens too is that there's a lack of preparedness, at least in terms of our students, when it comes to reflection on the issue. What is likely to happen is that you get your ideas from whatever media source, and usually a politicized one, tells you about the issue. And so what ends up is that people have kind of this applies to students too, I think, coming into the classroom, have kind of a dualistic way of thinking about it. Is either love the migrant or uphold the rule of law or something like that. Wow. So you have a lot of that going on. And in fact, when I wrote or drafted a document for the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, Immigrants Among Us, on this issue, it was interesting to hear the reactions of, the first committees looking at this. And they were basically kind of on both sides again. One was, let's do everything we can to love the neighbor. What about love the neighbor do you not understand? And the other side is, well, how do we obey the authorities? And, how do we, what about illegal do you not understand? So that's kind of like, that duality, this either or, that if you, if you really care about law and so on, you wouldn't just have open borders. And if you really, care about the migrant, you wouldn't be talking about the law. And the fact is that we need a richer conversation that brings up the complexity of the issue while keeping the migrant's face in the midst of it, so that nothing becomes so abstract that all of a sudden the migrant is sort of lost in the shuffle. So that's, I think, in some ways the challenge of that conversation. And what has helped me is to see how there are different theological approaches nowadays on migration that have different starting points, and none of these approaches gives you the whole picture, but it helps you at least to have kind of a rich conversation about migration today in the United States.
So keep going. Give us an example of like the third way, a theology that would support the third way. So if not law and rigidness, and as if law came from on high and not from our ancestors and below, right? Or open borders, compassion for the neighbor, come one, come all. give us an example of theologies that help us think in the complexity that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognize is that both of these approaches have something true about them. I mean, the love your neighbor approach reminds us that all people are made in the image of God, that there is a place in a biblical narrative for the priority of the vulnerable. God's heart goes out to the vulnerable, and God's people are commanded to love the sojourner, as yourself. And so, and that's independent of any kind of legal status. It's unconditional. And so how do we embody that? So that's the truth about that perspective, which I tend to call the hospitality approach to migration. And there are tons of them. In fact, I think the churches typically tend to focus on that, and for good reason. Then you have, I think, what you see, people who are, involved in thinking about political science and politics, but they also do it from a religious perspective. And they bring this other approach, which we were talking about, which I call the legal approach. I'm not sure that it's maybe the best way to talk about it, but it tends to think in terms of a preferential option for neighbors who are, close to us in terms of geography, and therefore, citizens and residents of a country, and what responsibilities do we have towards them, and how then does that relate to the foreigner or the one who comes from another country, and so what responsibilities do we have towards those neighbors who are not like us? And I think, they tend to be more sort of realistic. You have to deal with nation states, you have to deal with public policy. We like what the hospitality people are saying, but it could be too general. How do we land the plane, and make this into public policy that actually kind of works? And that's a great challenge because, we haven't had like decent immigration legislation in the United States for, many, many years. Mm-hmm. So really weak on the public policy. Then I think maybe you talked about a third way. One example of a third approach, I think, would be something like what I call a relational, could potentially be called a transnational approach to migration. In other words, that migration is not just an issue of, this cosmopolitanism where we just kind of love everybody. I always say, if you love everybody, you end up loving nobody, because you have to be, you have to land at some point the discussion towards concreteness here. Which neighbors are we talking about? Which needs, which priorities? And then the other one tends to be more what they call a communitarian. That's the legal approach. So first you think about your own communities first, and your way of life and language, and how do you want to structure yourself. And but no one is thinking transnationally, which is interesting because immigration is a global issue, right? I mean, we're talking different countries here. It's not just about the United States. Migration is going on all around the world. We've never seen so much people displaced in history. So this can't just be a nation state issue. It can't just be sort of the general neighbor issue that we love. There are systems, in place that drive migration. This is not take away from the moral agency of migrants who also make decisions, family unity, for instance, economic labor stuff, fleeing from gangs and stuff like that. I mean, people make decisions, fine, but there are larger systems, that drive migration as well. And I think that's a third perspective that is often lost in the shuffle. And so there is actually a theologian, a Catholic a woman theologian, Tisha Rajendra, who's doing some work in this area. I think she teaches at Loyola in Chicago in ethics. And she says, justice is responsibility to the demands of a relationship. Therefore, the relational model. So she asks, what kind of relationship should we be looking at between citizens and migrants? And she says there are probably at least three kinds of those relationships. One would be colonial histories. Are there colonial or quasi-colonial relationships that drive migration, say of the children of those people who were formerly colonized? The other one would be guest worker programs. When a worker migrates, families come with them. What responsibilities do we have to their children and so on? And the other one would be sort of economic arrangements, right? If you have this maquiladoras, right? You have arrangements where when you have companies on the other side of the border, right? Producing the goods that then you're going to consume at lower prices somewhere else. When you close those companies, people then all of a sudden see themselves without a job. Well, they're probably going to migrate. So what responsibilities do we have towards neighbors with whom we as a country at some point in our history enter into a relationship?
So how did your students react to the third model, right? Because the third model is about, and you introduced this, is about an awareness of global citizenry, not just nationalistic identity, right? So was global citizenry a new concept for your students? You know what I mean? Were they comfortable with it? Did they react to it? Were they saying, yeah, finally somebody gets what we've known intuitively, and you scholars are just behind and we already know this?
Well, it's interesting when it comes to issues, like food, or music, or even reading novels, from different authors. Everybody wants to be a global citizen, right? But when it comes to this issues like immigration,
land and money, when you start parsing the land and the money.
Yeah, it's a territorialism, It's defending our own and our way of life and our language. And so it could become very nationalistic, in a bad way. I think what helps is to show that even those people who come from that communitarian perspective about national identity and so on, they themselves will make room in their political theories about neighbors that we have a moral obligation to, even if they're not citizens and residents of our nation. And they do it on the basis of things like, international law and what's the United Nations thinking about, for instance, the status of refugees. So we have to make room for refugees because, they have a particularly morally compelling reason for fleeing. And we can't just, let him die or leave him without a country. And I think, a lot of countries today would agree to that. There's a cosmopolitanism in that. So I think when you show that even some communitarian perspectives or legal approaches make room for things like the refugee, all of a sudden, it makes sense to be sort of global in your thinking while also keeping in mind local realities or something like that. Another example would be family unity. There is kind of an international consensus that we should keep families together. This is why, these policies under the former administration about separating families was often seen as just sort of, if not misguided, just plain wrong, even by people who would normally be on the communitarian national identity side of things, because now you're messing with families. And that's like a big no-no, you know? So I think that's the consensus also internationally.
So for so many schools who have launched into the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So that's one of the places where schools are saying we're trying to reach past our original identities. We're trying to be open. Immigrant status and immigrating people in their complexity mess up most diversity, equity, and inclusion simplistic understandings about what schools should be about.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So people are still trying to decide about the people who have citizenship in this country, whether they're in or out. The migrant complexifies all of that to say, regardless of which of these schemas, which of these theologies you're leaning toward, most schools are not stretching toward recent immigrant populations because they don't fit into these neat little boxes that aren't real little boxes in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're asked about status, it's usually as a way to, or at least in many instances, a way to exclude you in some way.
That's right. That's right.
You know, and we're all over the place in the United States on this issue of the inclusion of the migrant in the educational process.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting about this is that there is no, in my understanding, there is no federal law that prohibits undocumented immigrants from studying in the United States. Now, there are laws concerning international students, meaning they're outside the country, and then there needs to be a process for them to kind of apply for a visa and all that stuff.
Right? All the visa status
the
stuff.
Visa status, But interestingly, for the undocumented, well, right off the bat, elementary school and secondary school, you have to send your schools by law, and documented and documented status don't fit into it. Federally speaking, at the level of higher ed, and that would include seminaries, by the way. There's no federal law telling you that you can't have an undocumented immigrant studying with you. The issue would be what happens when you have to maybe place that person in ministry. Then you're dealing with like labor issues, and churches are scrambling to see what kind of policies, like, can we have someone who doesn't like earn a salary? Is that moral? Can they be a volunteer instead, but we sort of give them stipends related to expenses?
A bag of potatoes and a chicken, right?
Yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah, so even that raises issues about how we should deal with migrant neighbors in ways that are salutary and includes them fully in our life together. And I think schools struggle with that, how to do that.
So global mobility and people moving from country to country en masse, and I'm just repeating what you said earlier, is escalating. It's not settling down. As the weather changes, as the pandemic and the pandemics and the COVIDs and all these kind of stuff affect us, the higher education and theological education are not ready for the very question that you're raising.
Yeah. What is the place of the migrant and the children of migrants in our life together? And that means in our educational structures, in our systems of admissions, in the resources we receive from donors. Could you imagine someone saying, some of our appeals to funding this year are going to be especially targeting, dreamers. What are you talking about? They don't have status yet, or they have some status, but they're kind of, they're waiting for full recognition.
Or the flip side of that is, I'm giving this chunk of money, but do not use it for dreamers.
Yeah, right, right.
right? There's there is the possibility of that kind of bigotry as this issue becomes more and more pressing in our schools.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the ways that that I've been sort of developing as maybe a fourth way, since we're talking about first, second, third, fourth. Let's maybe talk about a fourth way. So one of the things that I like to put out there is that maybe there is something like a vocational approach to migration. Vocation meaning calling, from the Latin vocare, to call. So that the idea here is that everyone has been called by God to serve their neighbor from a particular location, a vocational location, right? So you have mothers, they have a calling to take care of, their children. You have artists, they have a calling, to speak to the place of beauty in our lives and this kind of stuff. Teachers, right? We have a calling, right? So what if we were to look at the immigration issue from that angle and then ask, what resources do I have in my calling or callings, because they're plural. We're just not one kind of, person, but we have many different vocations. And what are the resources, what kind of authority or power have we been given? This is the Spider-Man thing, to whom who has been given great power, right, has also been given great responsibility. Yeah. We thank Spider-Man, for it. So what can we do from that perspective? And then how do we unleash the power of what I call collective vocation, where you as an individual might not have, the power to do something, but when you get together with people who have a similar passion or are looking at an issue from that particular angle, or maybe there are different vocations coming together around an issue, then you have the power advocacy. You see, you have the power to focus on particular neighbors you want to speak for, and you have the kind of the know-how that you wouldn't have just as an individual. And I think this vocational angle helps people look at the immigration debate from their particular place. And it sort of demands that everybody have some kind of response to it. But do it from an understandable place. I give you an example of this. I had a student who was struggling in the classroom with the notion of, legality, illegality, right? So he was looking at the immigration issue from the legal approach. So along a spectrum of legality, illegality. And I was wondering, why is this guy so interested in this that he won't listen to the other perspectives? In other words, what is it that,
has captured his curiosity, right?
Yeah, why is he stuck in some ways? And then I had more personal conversations with him, right? Which reminds me that you can't solve everything in the classroom, understood as the four the four walls, and nowadays the Zoom meeting place. How do you take him aside and go a little deeper, right? What's going on here? Well, after talking for a while, I found out that what's really happening is that his daughter was married to an undocumented immigrant. So for him, what he was really concerned about wasn't some macro picture, about how everything should be legally done. It was really about keeping a family together.
He was afraid, right? He was looking for solutions for his fear and for his family.
Exactly. I mean, he was seeing the issue from his vocation as a, father, as a father-in-law. And then I found out that he also was a grandfather.
Which made it more important for him to keep his family together.
So all of a sudden that took a burden off his shoulders, because he said, oh yeah, I'm looking at the immigration issue from a place where I can put a human face on the issue And I would do everything in my power from those vocations, or get together with people, find the resources so that I can keep this family together at all costs.
But I applaud him for bringing his autobiography, for bringing his personal dilemma into the classroom conversation. So it's not abstract or obtuse, right? We don't want him to be stuck and only personal, but there's something about trusting the classroom, trusting the degree process to say, help me solve some real life issues, some real life dilemmas, rather than just being in ideas or in concepts that never quite hit the ground.
Right. So rather than just saying, what about love your neighbor? Do you not understand? Or what about illegal? Do you not understand? All of a sudden was more like, what about keeping your family together? Do you not understand? It moved beyond the duality that we talked about earlier. There was some progress made in the conversation.
It also recategorizes the vocational approach, also helps us rethink the difference between us and them and we, right? It messes with all that notion of community or notion of group, right? So in his case, his we was fairly remarkable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a potential problem with vocation, you always have to critique your own proposals. A potential problem with vocation is that you're so you see what your service is supposed to look like, but only from a social location. That, I think, is something we have to be watchful for. So, if you are in a social location where you don't come into contact, say, with migrants, it's very easy to dismiss them, and they remain they, and we remain we,
Right.
So I think this is why it's important, I think, to recognize that there are different people working from different vocations and different social locations who might call our attention to things we're not seeing, So, I mean, I live in a place here in suburban St. Louis, not very diverse. I mean, I was cutting the lawn when I moved into my new house about 4 years ago or whatever, and the neighbor next door comes over and says, "Now, are you our neighbor or do you work for our neighbor?"
Oh, Lord. You say yes, both. I am my own gardener. Thank you very much.
I was gonna say, I sleep with your neighbor. I was gonna say.
That's right. Welcome.
This is a family here,
Wow.
We have children and stuff,
Wow. And this person did not have enough sense to know that question was offensive. That's really unfortunate, but that's how it is.
But if you look more closely, we have the presence of the migrant all around. We just have to kind of open our eyes.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. So, but there's part of what you're challenging is we want to say all of us are the same and they are all the same. And you're saying we are not all the same and they are definitely not all the same. You just can't gloss over all these differences and reduce all this reductionistic thinking to say we are the same and they are the same, and therefore we can make these big leaps about whoever we are and whoever they are. Or if we do, we are continuing to buy into a colonialized white supremacist model of being in the human experience together.
Yeah, we could end up homogenizing everybody, just like we do with terms like Black or Hispanic.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And the eye-opening thing about accounting for the diversity of the migrants. The eye-opening thing is when I tell students, do you know how many visa types there are for migrants in the United States? I mean, you want to talk about legality? Let's talk about legality, and all of a sudden I say, you have refugee. That's a different process. Then you have asylum seekers. That's a different process. All right. Then you have, visas for battered spouses and children. Then you have human trafficking visas. Then you have temporary protected status, like the people from Venezuela right now. I was just hearing someone from Venezuela fleeing the political instability, trying to get temporary protected status. Then you have the dreamers and what they're kind of working out with that. And then there are, visas that are family-based. Now, having said that, there are categories where no one fits, and you're kind of stuck, and there's no way that you can legally, migrate or stay or whatever. There's no legal remedy, and that's a problem too. But having said that, just by showing students the variety of ways of thinking about legality, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I didn't know that. See, I just thought that everybody who came here illegally. You see? So sometimes you have to move away from this homogenizing, I think the term you use, colonializing, where I can homogenize everything into one category and then either dismiss it or romanticize it. And no, we have to actually go deeper. You see, we have to put a face to this. It could be that in a conversation with an undocumented immigrant, you find out that they are a battered spouse. All of a sudden, you have a potential legal remedy that wasn't there before. But that means you have to stop homogenizing.
That also means their identity, because of those kinds of systems, their identity becomes those systems of paperwork and those systems of bureaucracy.
Oh yeah,
which has a whole other quagmire in and of itself.
Absolutely, there are so many different processes that require, putting yourself before an immigration judge, and there's a lot of discretionary power given to an immigration judge. And you just don't know where they're going to land on that decision. Your chances go exponentially higher if you actually have someone representing you.
Oh, absolutely.
And
legal
a lot of
or
people,
otherwise, right? Legal.
Yeah, and a lot of times people don't have access to this.
So the people you're describing, some of them will be students in our classrooms. That's the point. So the point of our conversation is not to say this is a phenomenon going on in life. The point is to say these brothers and sisters will be in our classrooms. Absolutely. And we have to be aware and conscious and compassionate, and also find ways to be advocates and understand what they're up against when they come in to learn with us and from us.
Yeah. And here is where that relational perspective that we talked about earlier, I think is helpful, because it says that when we start relationships with people, okay, once you admit them, you have a responsibility to the student from that moment on. They're no longer they, they're we. And
matriculation has to mean something. That ritual of matriculation in these schools has to mean something.
Yeah, and then placement afterwards, or retention strategies. They become an alumni of the institution forever, so yeah.
The other complexifying factor is these brothers and sisters will also become our colleagues.
Oh, yeah.
Many of our colleagues in the academy are dealing with visa issues. They are not only our students, they are also our colleagues who are struggling in these quagmires.
Yeah. And so the question then is, what responsibilities do we have as an institution who started a relationship, you see? And this is where the relational perspective is helpful. Someone, I think some years ago in an interview, this was in a church context, where someone said, well, what would be the problem with just sending everyone back to Mexico? Again, the homogenizing, right? Everybody comes from Mexico.
Indeed.
And so let's send them all back to Mexico. I said, well, I suppose that's one option. But how many of those are your own brothers and sisters? Wash in the blood of the Lamb. In other words, I mean, now because you're connected to them, you see, through faith or baptism, you see, or life together, then you can't just say, let's just send them all back to Mexico, because you now have other types of responsibilities towards and because of that relationship, and I think is a perspective that requires understanding the complexity and diversity and unique gifts of the migrant and in the context of relationships.
Or if you're going to say the baptized migrant is an exception to the rule of we, then you have to be courageous enough to say that bigotry out loud and be the racist, that the theological racist that you are, in making that statement. Let us send our baptized migrant brothers and sisters back to Mexico. It's almost a non sequitur.
Yeah, I know. And it's interesting when you look at the Catholic Church on migration. It started with a concern for Italian immigrants, for instance. How do we provide spiritual care when they're no longer here? But then there was also a shift saying, if we're about the communion of all people and all families of the earth among themselves and with God, then we ought to be concerned not only with our own brothers and sisters, but also with other brothers and sisters, And so the thinking about migration and how it involves all kinds of neighbors. Now, I think the notion of priority is probably okay at some point, because we're not superhuman. And some decisions have to be made in terms of, what resources do we have, for instance, to assist particular neighbors, and what priorities go first, and then who do we try to deal with later. And, I think there's something perhaps very human about that. We just have to make sure that, that those decisions are not made on the basis of maybe not liking people who look a little different and speak a little different. Then you
have an accent, right? The one
have an accent,
right? They have an accent.
Yes,
so
yes,
do you.
I know. Who doesn't?
That would be the point, right?
Yeah, I know.
If you haven't moved past your own borders and your own boundaries, these arbitrary borders and boundaries that we think are not arbitrary, but they are. Yeah. So my lad, this might not the smoothest segue, but you're also interested, Leo, in spirituality. Right. So many of the kinds of theologies that you're talking about in terms of migrant activity and migrant brothers and sisters is undergirded by your understanding of spirituality. So help us understand a little bit where those things intersect.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, for a while, I've been thinking also interesting, that we're talking about homogenizing things. So I think sometimes spirituality could become another one of those abstract homogenizing categories. So, I see, on the other hand, really kind of a rich diversity of narratives about what it means to be spiritual, or what it means to embody a life in the spirit. And the way, the set way for me into that conversation has been through the study of the life of Jesus and what kind of life he embodies. And that's what a life in the spirit looks like, So I kind of work from the field of what's called spirit Christology. I wrote my dissertation in this area and I haven't stopped since. But at some point I sort of moved towards how is this helpful for describing in some way, life in the spirit? And without trying to be exhaustive, I've moved into the notion of models. The different sets of narratives with different concerns that attend to different needs and this kind of stuff. And one of those models is the hospitality model. There are others, but the hospitality model, it seems particularly fit to talk about how you deal with, neighbors who are often dismissed or excluded, not welcome, you see. And so there are certain narratives where you see Jesus sort of embodying the hospitality of the kingdom. And you see it. One of the ones I especially like is Luke 17, the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is walking along the border between Samaria and Galilee. And that was like a no place to be, because the Samaritans, they're the enemy. They're, they're religiously and racially mixed, right? You want to stay away from those people.
Mhm.
And then the Galileans weren't seen as the ideal, pure, law-abiding Jews, ritually and otherwise, and here I draw a lot from the work of Elizondo and other Hispanic theologians who talked about the marginality of Galilee and that kind of stuff. So this is like the wrong place. This is the the wrong part of town to be walking.
Shady places, right? It's a shady
places,
place.
And yet the Samaritan leper, right, who's doubly marginalized on account of the leprosy and of being a Samaritan, surprisingly is the one who actually thanks Jesus and returns and praises God and so on. And so I think that narrative, is a narrative of inclusion into life with God, through Jesus. And this is what a spirituality looks like. It's it's this embodiment of welcoming and so on. And there are others like this, other narratives of this sort. And so I think that's where these fields have sort of intersected, right? So what are forms of embodying the spiritual life that help us as we encounter the neighbor other, so to speak, so that we see them as not just one of them, but one of us, because we too have been welcomed into God's life. And so who are we to exclude others from that life? So I think, that might be a way that they intersect.
So that spirituality certainly challenges the notion of that the stranger is strange, right?
Mm-hmm.
So often the stranger becomes a dehumanized being, a less than human being, a demonic being, or something other that, other has all these dynamism to it about how inhuman you are. This spirituality that you're articulating says the stranger is just a stranger, someone who is not yet met, not yet a friend, which is, which what Nouwen says about the stranger, rather than doing all the other things we do to dehumanize people we don't yet know. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think part of what the biblical narrative does too is that it wants you to put yourself in the place of the stranger.
That's right.
And there are a lot of narratives like that, like Israel. Remember, you were a stranger at one point because you were in Egypt and you were oppressed. So don't be acting differently now, Always remember that about yourself. And I think we have a lot of this amnesia about who we are, I mean, you look at Lutherans, for instance, at one point, English-speaking people seeing these Lutherans coming up the Mississippi, they would say the same things that the children of those same Lutherans say about other immigrants today. They don't want to learn the language. Who are these people? They bring strange customs. They bring diseases. I mean, it's the same kind of stuff. So, but we forget that history.
Yep, and repeat it over and over and over again.
I know. I mean, it's so my wife is, Irish, German, right? And so it's funny to hear the Irish side of the family complain about immigrants when Irish were despised.
That's right.
In this country, the bottom of the bottom, and so here you have this historical amnesia about stuff. The same things that people said about your people.
You now feel empowered to,
You are now saying about, your relatives' people, right? Because my wife is married to me, so she's connected to.
So how do we infuse, and this is a rhetorical question, the notion of justice into how we treat the next wave of peoples, rather than just taking on this power and competition to say, well, we're here and now you people, whoever you people, everybody has their you people, right? You people, rather than treating people like you people to say, well, what's the richness of these brothers and sisters that are coming, right? That's a very difficult question to get people to participate in. And like you said at the top of the conversation, make public policy about, right? These are not notions that are not, that these are notions that have to be embodied and institutionalized for justice to be how we all live together.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. The justice question, right? I mean, when I think of justice, I think justice, the idea of being rightly related to someone. It's interesting because there are studies on spirituality in North America. And I'm thinking here of, the book After Heaven. Um, but it talks about a shift, where people used to think of spirituality in terms of um, kind of a dwelling oriented mentality. So in other words, it has to do with the traditions and the dogmas and the authority of the house, where you dwell, the institutional approach to spirituality. I believe it because the authority says it. And it says there's been a move away from that, of course. But then the move away from that was more towards um, kind of a seeker oriented, more the cafeteria style, the tinkering with religion, what fits me best. That's what I want to do in terms of spirituality. But the problem there is that if one was too institutional and didn't allow for kind of personal appropriation of the spiritual life, the other one is too kind of loosey-goosey, It's very sort of self-fulfillment oriented. It's very individualistic, and so how how do you talk about spirituality simply as giving the client whatever he wants, or this kind of stuff becomes too sort of commercialized.
That's right. That's why people started going to Native American sweat lodges and all that kind of
Yeah,
craziness,
right, that
right?
kind of
Not
stuff.
knowing anything about Native American or sweat.
Exactly, wear your Che Guevara shirt or whatever. And what he says is that what people are kind of hungry for is, this is Robert Wood now. What he says is a practice-oriented spirituality. So in other words, the religious leader or the teacher, we might say, in the classroom is not simply someone who, we listen to because he speaks with authority. There should be more the institutional model, and is not supposed to just be there to give us whatever we want and makes us feel happy and happy snappy. But rather he or she embodies a certain form of life that could therefore then become very formative in the student's life. So I could talk all I want about immigration, right? But the question is, how do I embody this hospitality and welcome in the way I speak, in the way that I deal with students, right? The use of the body, the use of the voice, in the stories I tell, in bringing myself into that space as an immigrant myself, right? And my struggles and challenges there, I am not, I'm not just like, a keeper of orthodoxy. I am not just, someone who is sort of given access to goods, but I'm actually embodying a certain form of life. And I think that is what the studies on spirituality in North America, that's where they could be helpful as a way of helping us sort of embody a certain way of justice, we might say, that then people might pick up on.
And find their place in that embodiment, right? Yes. That they continue to understand the value of being an embodied person and the genuineness it takes to then move into other people that are embodied, right? It's a kind of incarnational pedagogy, an incarnational way to teach.
Yeah, they unleash the collective power of embodiment.
Yep. I'm for it. I am for it. Leo Sanchez, thank you so much for this conversation, this rich, rich conversation. I appreciate you.
Yes, it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
So next time when you come back, bring your bass.
There you go. Yeah, we'll talk more about the bass. Yeah.
Thank you. To our listeners, the Wabash Center website is the place to find our many resources. Look to our website for our podcasts, our blogs, our essays and articles. The Journal on Teaching can be found there, as well as information on our granting program. A special thanks to our podcast producer, Rachel Mills, And of course, the music which we use to frame our podcast are the original compositions of our own Paul Myrie. And we should ask Leo Sánchez to do some pieces to frame our podcast as well. Wabash Center for more than 25 years is exclusively funded by Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And we are out. How was that, Paul?